Welcome to our last lecture. The class is crazy how fast it went. I think it was probably even faster for you guys because you worked harder. So let's summarize a little bit what we've done today, but also have a little look, in the future. And as you probably will notice, I'm not a big fan of predictions, but I do think if we are informed, we can definitely make some projections, and that's what we were going to do today. So let's talk about the future of the Middle East. And I think with everything we have covered so far in this class, I think we have a pretty good basis on projecting how it goes forward and see where the major challenges of the regions are today. So I will go on and review a little bit what we have learned so far, and then I will talk about 3 possible scenarios that are not expansive. I'm just going to pick out a couple of specific areas, and I'm going to make some conclusions based on what we've learned so far in the last 3 weeks. So let me go on to do a review. So we've talked about the history, and I think, as you probably have all noticed, this is very much, it was a limited overview about the history, but we had some high points here. I think it's important to notice that those democracies that we have in the regions are really the one that has the most or the long-term history of independence from foreign powers. Tunisia, of course, now is the biggest example, but the biggest exception here. But we do have Turkey and Israel really being kind of independently in the region. Of course, the case of Israel is a little bit more complex than the one of Turkey, but it's important here really to keep in mind that European powers, and then after that obviously also Russia and the United States, were very active in the region and kind of not only draw artificial boundaries, but also their influence can also be kind of the external factor for the lagging economic performance of the region. It is, however, still puzzling why we don't see the economic development in the Middle East as we know it from East Asia. And we've looked a little bit into that later on in the class. There is, I think, one of the major explanations for why the Arab Spring, for example, happened was also that there's a lot of perception about the political and economic situation in the Middle East, as it is in every country. So we don't really see many shock factors that triggered the Arab Spring, but instead a constant development that was then coupled with a perceived inequality that then led to protests in 2010, 2011 forward. Instead of only focusing on these foreign powers being active in the Middle East, it is also very important to look at the regime. And the regime goes actually much further than what we know what a government is. It really goes into the guiding ideology of the elite, not only how they fill positions, but also the rules of the game, really how the structuring of the polity in a given nation. It's very important, much further than just the simple idea of a republic, a monarchy. Democracy, authoritarian is really important to keep in mind if you talk about restrictions to the development in the region. We've discussed that regime change is fairly rare, but if it happens, it can be gradual and incremental or revolutionary. We do have various types of regimes in the Middle East: republic, monarchies, some democracies, and more recently more and more failed states, which is one of the major challenges for the future, in my opinion. And the sources of legitimacy really vary widely, and I'll talk about democracy later. We notice that these sources of legitimacy are very key if you want to explore why democracy did not happen in a certain country. Further, what we've noticed to look at the political economy and the politics in each country, and you did that, but I think what you noticed is that there's a constant relationship and back and forth between politics and economy, and it's extremely important to look at that. So you cannot only look at the economics and the politics in separate kind of glasses, you really need to mix it in order to get the whole picture. We also introduced certain groups that can be connected to the political regimes. There are the resource endowment groups, so how much labor, how much resources do different countries have, and it actually kind of helps us group the countries but also the history of the political economy, you know, what happened economically and what happened politically at the same time. And we actually did discuss the fact that even though maybe there was economic potential, it was really the lack of political reforms that kind of prohibited maybe the economic potential, the development of economic potential in the Middle East. But also cultural, of course, limitations that we discussed later. On the part of the politics, it is important to look at the politics in every country to really understand why the economy is not growing and developing as much, because it's a lot about the struggle over those resources that can potentially grow an economy that the Middle East is actually struggling with. And that has partly to do with just the simple fact that there are a lot of artificial borders, so identity often crosses borders. Maybe Islam is really one of the only common factors of cultural identity that we have in the Middle East that really is spreading across the region. So there's no wonder why, you know, that Islam has plays such a big role in politics. But just simply the fact, you know, that it often crosses borders has perils, but often also potential, because that can include, you know, spur interregional economic cooperation and maybe even free trade. But the general high conflict potential or persistence of conflict in the region also leads to a very significant peril, and that is that most of the GDP is actually, not most of it, but a big part of the GDP is actually spent on the military throughout the MENA. So the politics in the MENA is often actually solved with the military strength rather than the democratic process. And that is a big peril for economic development. And then another aspect of politics is just the simple fact that we have a big amount of youth in these countries, that over 1/5 of the MENA population is between 15 and 30 years old. So we will have waves and waves and waves of, you know, even maybe university educated youth that come out of the university with a degree and no jobs. That obviously is also kind of the struggle over resources even more fierce then, especially when the political regimes in and of itself don't represent these youth. And then the MENA is also located in a very special place in the world, and in this like triad of international, economic, geopolitical, and the normative system. And they're very similar. They're very extreme or intense interests here. There's really much economic potential that is unused for all these reasons we have just discussed. But there's also, of course, it's geopolitically just key for many foreign powers. So it has been a struggle within the Ottoman Empire. It has been a struggled region during the Cold War, then in the 90s, and even today, of course, with the war on terror, and now even that kind of continues to shape the history and politics of the area. And so it was actually a very limited impact of democratization efforts from, for example, the EU or Europe or the US here in the region. So international relations, you know, as a matter of fact, didn't necessarily help the region to stabilize. Sometimes it just helped it to actually destabilize it. So when we look at why we don't have democracy in the region, and we kind of spent the whole third week on this question, I made the case that we don't have much evidence that it's actually that there are a lot of roadblocks for democracy, rather that we have that this is an absence of prerequisites of democracy is necessary, but not sufficient explanation of lack of democratization. It's really much more important to look at the conditions of the authoritarian regime in your country, in every specific country, to really understand why we don't have democracy. So instead of fostering democracy and the idea of it, or maybe even then blaming Islam for not being open for it, it's important to actually look at the authoritarian regimes and what makes them stay in power, or what makes them actually legitimize their power more generally. After the Arab Spring, we've seen only really two countries towards a transition of the towards democratic transitions, and I make the case the Arab Spring is not necessarily only interesting because it led maybe to more democracy in the region or less, but it's rather interesting to see which different social movements actually made it up to the top and kind of like give you good good kind of window into modern development of Middle East societies. Today we can definitely see more persistence and change, or even a backlash against democracy even more. So we actually have a rather reinforcement of coercive regimes, for example, Egypt, or then also Algeria, or even, of course, the failed states like Syria or Libya at the moment. So I made the case also that we talk a little bit about Islamism as a social movement and how it is interesting, kind of developed over time, and what kind of place it tried to find within the Arab Springs. And there's a very rigorous debate within Islamic thought on the compatibility of democracy and Islam. And I don't think that debate is finalized in any way. I think it's still ongoing, which I think is a very healthy thing and part of civil society to have that debate. There is generally, I think, a very, you can question if there's actually any connection or direct correlation, how we call it in academics, between religion and democracy. We don't have any prior evidence that more religious societies are less democratic, or the other way around. Here also the same way. There are probably other reasons why we see democracy or not, and not necessarily religion. So it's only part of the explanation. I think the political regime actually and the political economy deliver much stronger arguments for the chances of democracy, and I think this is exactly where we need to work on if our idea is to have the Middle East more democratized in the future. That are the two issues we need to focus on, political and economic development. And I think the Arab Spring was and is a watershed moment for this debate between Islam and democracy, and we can still see it playing out. So far, we only have Turkey and Tunisia being an example of a successful democracy, and we'll see how these experiments go further. So let me talk you to three scenarios that are not, I cannot even talk nearly about everything that's going on in the Middle East and what I think is going to happen in 2025. Of course, a lot depends also always on the interests of foreign powers, as we have seen in the past. If they decide to have another major intervention in any way or not, that can always change the course of history quite significantly. But let's just focus on these political regimes and economies that I just talked about, that I feel are important. And that's where actually also foreign powers can start supporting the Middle East more. So let's start with the negative. The negative scenario is there will be a complete focus on resources, on security and stability of all the regimes. Not enough investment in the modernization of the economy, so the economy does not grow significantly. We'll have a new generation of well-educated youth, but still without jobs. So more instability, more protests coming, and we will have more and more restrictions of personal freedoms. For example, just 80% of the population will probably use the internet by 2025 in the Middle East, and 50% of the content will be banned. Cyber surveillance is expanded. Cyberspace being a new era for regimes in the Middle East to control their citizens. Now we will go a little bit out of the negative realm and maybe the mixed bag. We will have around 80 million more jobs in the Middle East by 2025, but still 27% youth unemployment. That comes because we obviously have a pretty, the population in the region is growing quite significantly. We do have a regional free trade agreement in place with the Arabian Peninsula, with North Africa, with the Eastern Mediterranean, but it was not necessarily effective enough to modernize the economy because we still have the concentration of stability and just not enough focus on building up the economy. The positive side is positive scenario. We might have a Marshall Plan in 2025 for the Middle East that actually comes from within the region, so without any influence from the United States or Europe. Around maybe $100 billion just for business initiatives and new economy that was actually effective. So the Central Bank of Qatar and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia used the money from the new oil boom now in 2014 going on to actually really invest in economies all over the region and not only give them money for the budget as they do now out of political reasons, for example for Egypt, Morocco, or Tunisia and so on, but also really significantly contribute to the reduction of unemployment and a growing GDP in the region. So I think there's still the potential for them to do that. So in conclusion, I think we can say there's no way to grow politics more stable or make the Middle East more growing without fostering the political or economic development in the region. So we need to focus on getting the Arab foreign direct investment put into good use, but also focus at the same time on political regimes to make that more attractive. I think economy is part of the solution, but as we've learned, not only the economy, but we also have to engage in political reform, and that can only be done within the region, right? And so you've noticed that it's really a focus on within the region. So a big, I think it's pretty clear that intervention of foreign powers did not do any good in the Middle East in the last decades or centuries, and I think it is rather more than time to focus on supporting their economies, and maybe even letting actually the Middle East a little bit alone and not intervening economically or politically too much. Okay, so that's it for me. It's a rather short little overview, but I think it kind of wrapped up a little nicely what we talked about in the class. So I'm looking forward to your research papers this week, and I want to thank you. I think it was a very interesting experience. I enjoyed teaching you, and if you have any questions, you're always welcome to email me. I also have a book out that was published 2016 on Morocco's relationship to the European Union and how the European Union was actually able to influence Morocco's reform or not. I also more or less regularly post on transatlantic relations in my blog, so please check it out, and never hesitate to email me if you have any questions. Bye.